Listen carefully because this message is not a coincidence and it is not random that you clicked on this video today because there is someone watching right now who has been silently asking God why certain people suddenly disappeared from their life without explanation, why conversations stopped, why connections faded, why relationships that once felt permanent suddenly became distant and confusing and painful, and you have been wondering if you did something wrong or if maybe you lost something important. But what you did not realize is that heaven was working behind the scenes the entire time, removing the wrong people before sending the right one into your life, because sometimes what feels like rejection on earth is actually protection from God, and sometimes what feels like loss is actually divine preparation for something greater that you cannot yet see but God can see clearly. And the reason this message found you today is because you are standing in a transition season right now. Whether you realize it or not, and God is clearing space around you on purpose, not to punish you, not to isolate you, but to prepare your life for the connection that will match your destiny instead of delaying it, because there are people who were meant to walk with you temporarily, but they were never meant to walk with you permanently, and the moment they stayed longer than their assignment, your peace started disappearing, your clarity started fading, and your purpose started slowing down. And God loves you too much to allow the wrong presence to block the right promise that He has already scheduled for your future. And I know there were nights when you questioned everything, nights when silence from certain people hurt more than words ever could, nights when you wondered why someone you trusted suddenly changed without warning, and maybe you even blamed yourself, thinking you were too much or not enough, or maybe you thought you were the reason things fell apart. But what you could not see at the time was that God was answering a prayer you prayed months ago, maybe even years ago, when you asked Him to send the right person into your life. And what most people do not understand is that before God sends the right person, He removes the wrong ones first, because the wrong people cannot stay in the environment where your next blessing is about to arrive. And the reason separation felt so uncomfortable is because growth always feels uncomfortable when it begins, and God knew that if certain people stayed connected to your life, they would interfere with the doors He is about to open for you. And sometimes the greatest evidence that God is working in your life is not who is staying but who is leaving, because every removal carries a purpose, even when it carries pain. And I need you to understand something very important right now. The distance you experienced was not abandonment, it was alignment. The silence you experienced was not punishment, it was preparation. And the confusion you experienced was not failure, it was redirection, because God is extremely intentional about who He allows to stand beside you when your breakthrough finally arrives. And there is someone watching this who thought they lost their closest support system, but what actually happened is that God removed the people who could not celebrate where you are going, because where you are going requires loyalty that does not change when your life starts elevating. And God knew exactly who could handle your future and who could not. And sometimes He removes people quietly, because explaining everything in advance would only delay your obedience. And if you are honest, there were moments when you already felt something shifting inside those relationships, moments when conversations felt different, moments when effort became one-sided, moments when peace slowly disappeared, but you ignored those signs because your heart wanted to hold on to what your spirit already knew was changing. And God allowed the separation to happen not because He wanted to hurt you, but because He wanted to protect what He is building through you and around you and ahead of you. And what makes this season difficult is that removal rarely feels like a blessing when it first begins, but later it always reveals itself as protection and positioning and preparation. And the truth is, the right person cannot enter your life while the wrong environment is still occupying the space they are meant to step into. And this is why some relationships ended Without closure, some friendships faded without explanation, some connections stopped without warning, because God does not negotiate with what is trying to delay your destiny. He simply removes it when the time is right and replaces it with what aligns with your assignment. And there is someone listening right now who thought they were being left behind, but in reality you were being moved forward faster than you realized, because when God starts removing distractions, it means acceleration is about to begin, and when He starts clearing emotional space, it means something meaningful is preparing to enter your life, and what you thought was the end of something stable was actually the beginning of something divine. And I need you to hear this clearly today. The right person is not coming to confuse you. The right person is not coming to drain your peace. The right person is not coming to compete with your purpose. The right person is coming to confirm what God already placed inside you and support the direction your life is moving toward. And the reason God had to remove certain people first is because their presence was connected to a previous version of you that you have already outgrown, and the future you are stepping into cannot carry relationships that belong to your past identity. And this is exactly why everything started shifting when you began praying differently, thinking differently, believing differently, and trusting God more deeply than before, because transformation always changes your environment before it changes your circumstances. And the moment God saw that your heart was ready for something real, something aligned, something lasting, He began rearranging the people around you, even if you did not understand it at the time, and even if it hurt more than you expected. Because sometimes the greatest sign that the right person is getting closer is that the wrong people suddenly feel farther away than ever before. And what you are experiencing right now is not random. It is preparation, and what you thought was rejection is actually redirection, and what you thought was loneliness is actually positioning, because God never removes something without replacing it with something better that matches the future He designed specifically for you. And if certain people walked away without fighting to stay, it is because their assignment in your life had already ended, even if your heart needed more time to accept it. But heaven already knew what was coming next for you, and heaven never makes mistake when it starts making room for your next connection. And what many people do not realize is that when God begins removing the wrong people from your life, it often feels confusing at first, because you expected answers but instead you received distance. You expected clarity but instead you received silence. You expected restoration but instead you experienced separation. And during those moments it is easy to believe something went wrong, when in reality something finally started going right, because God does not remove people randomly. He removes them strategically, especially when their presence begins interfering with the purpose He placed inside your life long before you even met them. And there is someone watching this right now who kept trying to fix relationships that God was already trying to close, because your heart was loyal but heaven was protective. And while you were praying for restoration, God was preparing replacement, not because those people were evil, not because those connections were meaningless, but because they were seasonal. And seasons are never meant to last forever, no matter how comfortable they once felt. And sometimes God allows distance to grow between you and certain people, because staying connected to them would quietly delay the timing of something greater that is already on its way toward you. And I know there were moments when you replayed conversations in your mind trying to understand what changed, moments when you questioned whether you should reach out again, moments when you wondered if maybe you should have tried harder. But what you could not see at the time is that heaven was already answering a deeper prayer that your heart whispered long before the separation ever happened. Because when you asked God to protect your peace, He listened. When you asked Him to guide your future, He responded. And when you asked Him to send the right person into your life, He immediately began removing the wrong ones, even if the process felt uncomfortable, even if the Transition felt unexpected even if the silence felt heavier than you were prepared to carry, because divine alignment rarely feels easy while it is happening, but it always makes sense once the new chapter begins. And there is something powerful happening in your life right now that many people around you cannot even recognize yet, because while they see endings, God sees beginnings; while they see distance, God sees direction; while they see loss, God sees preparation. And what you are stepping into next requires emotional space, spiritual clarity, and relational alignment that simply cannot exist while the wrong voices are still influencing your decisions and your confidence and your vision. And this is exactly why certain conversations started feeling heavier than before, certain friendships started feeling different than before, and certain connections that once felt effortless suddenly required more effort than peace, because God was quietly revealing what your spirit already sensed, but your heart was still learning how to accept. And sometimes the most loving thing God can do for your future is remove what your past keeps trying to hold onto, because the right person cannot arrive into a space that is already filled with confusion, hesitation, or divided loyalty. And the truth is, the right person God is preparing for your life will not require you to shrink your faith. They will not require you to silence your calling. They will not require you to question your worth, because divine connections bring confirmation, not confusion. They bring strength, not stress. They bring clarity, not chaos. And the reason God is clearing space around you right now is because what He is sending next is meant to stay longer than what just left. And I know it did not feel like preparation when certain people stopped showing up for you the way they used to, and I know it did not feel like protection when conversations became shorter and colder and more distant than before. But sometimes God removes support systems that were built on comfort so He can replace them with connections that are built on purpose. And there is someone listening right now who thought they were being forgotten, but heaven has been focusing on you more than ever before, because whenever God is preparing to introduce the right person into your life, He first strengthens your identity so that you will recognize them when they arrive and not settle for less just because it feels familiar. And what you are experiencing right now is not isolation, it is preparation. And what you are feeling right now is not abandonment, it is positioning. And what you are walking through right now is not delay, it is divine timing, moving quietly behind the scenes even when everything around you feels uncertain. And this is why your circle started changing. This is why your conversation started shifting. This is why your priorities started realigning, because God is not just sending someone new into your life, He is sending someone who matches the version of you that you are becoming, not the version of you that you used to be. And that kind of connection requires space. That kind of connection requires healing. That kind of connection requires clarity. And heaven will always prepare the environment before releasing the promise. And if certain people suddenly lost interest in staying connected to you, it is not because you became less valuable, it is because you became more aligned with your purpose. And not everyone is assigned to walk beside you when your life starts moving toward its next level. And the moment God saw that you were ready for something real, something stable, something meaningful, something lasting, He began rearranging the relationships around you, even if it happened quietly, even if it happened unexpectedly, even if it happened faster than your heart was ready to accept, because divine preparation never waits for comfort, it moves according to calling. And what God is sending into your life next will make sense of everything that did not make sense before. It will bring peace where confusion once existed. It will bring clarity where questions once lived. And it will bring confirmation that every separation you experienced was never meant to harm you, but to guide you toward the connection that heaven has been preparing specifically for your future all along. There is something powerful happening in your life right now that you may not fully understand yet, because when God begins removing the wrong people before sending the right one, He is not just changing your circle, He is changing your future, and many times the silence that follows those exits feels confusing, even painful, because you expected loyalty where there was only convenience. You expected support where there was only presence, and you expected forever from people who were only assigned for a season. But what you didn't realize is that God saw conversations you never heard, intentions you never noticed, and dangers you never recognized, and that is why He stepped in quietly and started separating you from environments that looked normal but were slowly draining your purpose. Because sometimes the greatest protection God gives is not a visible miracle but an invisible removal. And the moment certain people left your life you thought something was breaking, yet heaven knew something sacred was being protected, because the right people cannot walk into a crowded space filled with the wrong ones, and God will never send destiny connections into confusion-filled environments, which means every goodbye you experienced recently was not rejection but preparation. Not abandonment but alignment, not loss but repositioning. Because God is extremely intentional about who stands next to you in the season where your life begins to accelerate, and if He allowed certain people to stay, they would misunderstand your growth, question your calling, or compete with your peace instead of protecting it, and that is why you suddenly felt distance from people who once felt permanent. Because God was creating space for relationships that will not just celebrate your presence but strengthen your purpose, and the truth is the right people are not impressed by your struggles or intimidated by your growth. They are assigned to walk with you through both without confusion, without jealousy, and without conditions. And what many people don't realize is that destiny relationships recognize you before they fully know you, they respect your spirit before they understand your story, and they support your direction even when they don't see the entire path yet, which is why God removes the wrong voices first so the right voices can be clearly heard. Because guidance becomes impossible when your life is filled with distractions disguised as friendships, and sometimes the loneliness you feel right now is not emptiness but construction, not silence but preparation, not delay but divine arrangement happening behind the scenes in ways you cannot yet measure. Because the right person God is preparing for your life is not someone who will slow your growth but someone who will multiply your courage, not someone who questions your faith but someone who strengthens your vision, not someone who competes with your calling but someone who protects your assignment, and that kind of connection cannot arrive while your life is still surrounded by people who misunderstand your value. Which means every uncomfortable separation you experienced recently was heaven clearing the path for something stronger than what you lost, and even though your heart may still be asking why certain people disappeared without explanation, God is gently reminding you that not every exit needs closure when the purpose of the exit was protection, because sometimes clarity arrives later but protection always arrives exactly on time, and what you are stepping into now is a season where God is not just removing wrong relationships but restoring your ability to trust again, restoring your confidence again, restoring your belief that the right people still exist and are already moving closer to your path at the exact moment heaven planned long before you ever noticed the changes happening around you. There is a reason why after certain people walked away from your life you began to notice a strange quietness around you that at first felt uncomfortable but slowly started to feel peaceful, because when God begins removing the wrong people before sending the right one He is not only protecting your future connections He is healing your present environment. And many times what feels like emptiness is actually divine silence preparing your spirit to recognize something better than what you were previously accepting, because when the wrong people stay too long they slowly train your heart to tolerate confusion, inconsistency, and emotional distance as if those things are normal. But God refuses to let your destiny grow in a place where your value is constantly questioned and your peace is repeatedly interrupted, which is why He sometimes allows relationships to end without warning so that your spirit can finally breathe again without pressure, without comparison, and without pretending to be someone you were never created to become. Because the truth is, the right people God is preparing for your life will never require you to shrink your personality just to remain accepted, and they will never expect you to silence your calling just to remain included. And what you are experiencing right now is not isolation but restoration, because God is rebuilding your confidence from the inside out so that when the right connections arrive you will no longer feel desperate to keep them, but ready to recognize them, because desperation attracts confusion but clarity attracts alignment, and this is the season where God is teaching your heart the difference between people who are sent to walk beside you and people who are only allowed to pass through your story for a short time. And once that understanding begins to settle inside your spirit, you will stop chasing people who were never assigned to stay, and you will start walking forward with a quiet confidence that what belongs in your life will never need to be forced, because destiny relationships do not require constant explanations, they do not create unnecessary competition, and they do not disappear when your journey becomes difficult. Instead, they arrive with peace that feels unfamiliar at first but becomes recognizable as something your soul has been waiting for longer than you realize. And the reason God is preparing you so carefully before those connections appear is because the next relationships entering your life are not temporary encouragements but permanent reinforcements that will strengthen your direction and confirm your purpose in ways that previous relationships never could, which means every moment you spent feeling misunderstood was actually building the emotional strength you needed to recognize genuine support when it finally arrives. And even though part of you may still wonder why certain people were allowed to leave when you cared about them deeply, God is reminding you that love without alignment cannot carry destiny forward, and attachment without purpose cannot survive the season you are entering now, because where you are going next requires people who understand your silence as much as your words, who respect your growth instead of resisting it, and who celebrate your progress instead of secretly competing with it. And that is exactly why God is carefully preparing the right person to enter your life at the moment when your heart is no longer looking for approval, but ready for alignment, because when the right connection finally arrives it will not feel like confusion, it will feel like confirmation. It will not feel like pressure, it will feel like peace, and it will not feel temporary, it will feel like something heaven planned long before you ever experienced the removals that made space for it. Listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you right now is not a coincidence that you are hearing this message at this exact moment. This is the continuation of what God has already been doing behind the scenes in your life, and even though there were days when you felt forgotten, overlooked, delayed, and even misunderstood by people you trusted the most, God was never absent from your story. He was carefully removing confusion so clarity could finally enter your path. He was quietly separating noise so you could finally hear His voice again. And the truth is, the reason part 5 of your journey feels different is because this is the stage where God begins to reveal why certain doors stayed closed, why certain relationships faded away without explanation, and why some opportunities slipped through your hands even when you prayed desperately for them to stay. Because what felt like loss was actually protection, and what looked like rejection was actually divine redirection, and what seemed like silence was actually preparation for a season that is about to speak louder than anything you have experienced before. And God wants you to understand something powerful right now: that your waiting was never wasted time, your tears were never ignored, your patience was never invisible. Every silent night you questioned your purpose, and every moment you wondered if your faith still mattered, was being recorded in heaven as evidence that your spirit refused to give up even when your circumstances tried to convince you otherwise. And this is exactly why God is now shifting things around you in ways you cannot fully see yet, because He is aligning people who will recognize your value instead of questioning it. He is positioning opportunities that will honor your effort instead of draining your energy. And He is preparing answers that will arrive at the exact moment your heart is ready to receive them, without fear, without doubt, and without confusion, because the version of you that once begged for acceptance is being replaced by the version of you that walks confidently in purpose, knowing God Himself opened the door. And that is why the pressure you felt recently was not meant to break you, but to stretch your faith so you could step into something bigger than what you originally imagined. Because sometimes God allows uncertainty not to punish you but to strengthen your trust, so when the blessing finally arrives you will recognize that it did not come from luck or coincidence, but from divine timing that could never be rushed by human expectations. And right now, even if you cannot see the full picture, God is asking you to keep moving forward with courage, because the chapter you are entering is not about proving yourself to people who misunderstood you in the past, but about stepping fully into the assignment He designed specifically for you before anyone else ever had an opinion about your life. And the reason this moment feels different in your spirit is because something is already shifting internally before it becomes visible externally, and that is always how God works. First He changes your mindset, then He changes your environment, and then He changes your results. And what you are experiencing right now is the middle of that transformation, where old fears are losing their influence and new confidence is beginning to grow quietly inside you, even if nobody else can see it yet. And God wants you to remember that the delay you once cried about is the same delay that protected you from walking into situations that would have distracted you from your real purpose. Because if everything had happened when you originally wanted it to happen, you would not be the strong, wise, spiritually aware person you are becoming right now. And that strength you are developing is exactly what will help you carry the blessing that is closer than you think. Because not every blessing is light enough to carry without preparation, and not every opportunity is safe enough to receive without growth. And this is why God sometimes slows the process, so your heart can match the level of the promise He already prepared for you long ago. And as you continue walking forward through this season, there will be moments when you suddenly realize that things that once controlled your emotions no longer have power over you anymore, and that is not an accident. That is evidence that healing is happening even when you were not aware of it, and healing always comes before elevation, because God will never place you somewhere new without first making sure your spirit is strong enough to stay there with peace instead of fear. And right now heaven is closer to your situation than you think, even if your surroundings still look the same, even if the answers have not fully appeared yet, even if some people still doubt what God is doing in your life. Because what God is building for you is not temporary attention, but lasting purpose and lasting favor and lasting direction that no one will be able to take away from you once it arrives. So keep trusting even when the process feels slow, Keep believing even when progress feels invisible. Keep walking even when the road feels unfamiliar, because the same God who carried you through confusion is now guiding you into clarity, and the same God who protected you from what was wrong is now positioning you for what is right. And very soon you will look back at this season and realize that what felt uncertain was actually the moment everything began changing in your favor.